Okay, today we're going to focus on the properties of water. So this is the structure of water. This came up in our previous lecture, but I'm going to talk about it a little bit more today. So a reminder, here's what's going on with water. So oxygen is covalently bound to hydrogen, and these are called polar covalent bonds. Why are they called polar covalent bonds? Because the sharing between the oxygen and the hydrogen is uneven. I gave the analogy if I shared a candy bar with you, but instead of breaking it in half, I only gave you, say, a quarter of it and I ate the rest, we would have shared, but I got more than you did. So that's sort of like a polar covalent bond. And the reason that this happens is because oxygen has a higher electronegativity. So if you recall, I told you that that was sort of a measure of how much the oxygen pulls on the electrons compared to the hydrogen. Everything on the periodic table, has an electronegativity. Some things have higher electronegativities than others. And if something has a very high electronegativity, then it pulls really hard on electrons. And if something has a very low electronegativity, then it really doesn't pull very hard on electrons at all. And it turns out that oxygen's electronegativity is much, much higher than hydrogen's. Now, it's not enough for the oxygen to steal the electrons from hydrogen, because that would form an ionic bond, and that's not what happens in water. They're still sharing electrons, but it's a high enough electronegativity that the electrons are hanging around the oxygen a lot more than the hydrogens. So the oxygen acquires a partial negative charge. Why? Because electrons are negative. So if the electrons are hanging around the oxygen, in fact, I'm going to redraw it like this. So oxygen is actually very big, and the hydrogens, are much smaller. So here's my hydrogens here, my oxygen here, and there's actually these extra electrons that oxygen already has. And so what ends up happening is the electrons are sort of hanging around the oxygen a lot more than the hydrogens, and it's not actually a full-blown charge like they draw it here. It's actually what they call a partial charge. It looks almost like a figure 8, but like they forgot to finish it. It means partial. So the oxygen has a slight negative charge, and each of the hydrogens have a slight positive charge. Now, as a result of that, since opposites attract, the slight negative oxygen is attracted to hydrogens from other waters. So this is a hydrogen from another water with a slight positive, and the opposite charges attract them to each other. And so the hydrogen of one water, as you can see here, is attracted to the oxygen of another. Here's the hydrogen attracted to the oxygen. It's always the opposites, notice, that are attracting. And again, technically these are partial charges, not full-blown charges. So these dotted lines have a special name. They are called hydrogen bonds. But they're not permanent. They're being made and broken continuously in liquid water. I gave the analogy in class that if we were water molecules, imagine that every time we got close to each other, we had this unavoidable urge to shake hands. So we would shake hands, but then we would let go, but then we would see another water molecule in the room, and we'd want to shake their hand too, and then we would let go, and then we'd slide past them. And so constantly in liquid water, these molecules are floating around, and they're temporarily shaking hands with each other, and that intermolecular force, that attraction, is what makes water a liquid. So this gives water some specific properties. First, cohesion. That's the property of the water molecules sticking to themselves. So when water sticks to itself, that's cohesion. And I showed a couple little clips in class of this, but this would be why water, for example, would stick to itself on a penny. You get this water bubble if I put a bunch of drops on a penny, or if you've seen water on your car after it rains, and the water molecules sort of stick together. That's cohesion. Adhesion is when water sticks to other things. For example, water sticks really well to glass. You may remember from chemistry or like 8th grade science that if you ever put water in a graduated cylinder, one of those cylinder things that looks kind of like this, and then at the top it's got like a little thing like that, the water would dip. And you were always supposed to measure from this lowest point, but why does it dip? It's not actually dipping. What's actually happening is the water's climbing up the sides here, like this. It's sticking to the glass, and that's adhesion. So water is cohesive and adhesive. Water also has high surface tension. This is basically what's happening on the surface of the water. So this is why like a little water bug, which they have a picture of on the next slide, but a little water bug can actually walk across the surface and not fall through. It's not that that bug is less dense than water. In fact, I can float a paper clip on the surface of water if I'm really careful. It will sink if I bump it because it is actually more dense than water. But if I'm really careful, that surface tension, those water molecules sticking together, the hydrogen bonds at the surface are very, very strong. And it's almost like an invisible film. So if you smack water with your hand really hard, it hurts. Why does it hurt? You know, your hand does go through. I mean, it's just water. But that split second that it resists your hand breaking through, that's the surface tension. And it's very, very strong in water. And so the checkpoint question, beads of sweat on your face, well, it's stuck to your face because of adhesion, because that's water sticking to something else, the water sticking to your face. Now, technically, why does it form a droplet? That would be the cohesion, the water sticking to itself. So cohesive, it sticks to itself. Adhesive, it sticks to other things. This is a water strider. It's a kind of bug, and you can actually see how it actually does not penetrate the surface of the water. It's not because this bug is lighter than water. It's not lighter than water. Even if you float a leaf on water, if you push it under, it'll sink. But if it sets on the surface very delicately, it doesn't break that surface tension.
How does water get from the roots of a tree to its leaves? The evaporation of water from leaves moves water molecules up from the roots. The evaporation exerts a pull that is relayed downward along a string of water molecules from leaf to root. Hydrogen bonds cause water molecules to stick together, a phenomenon called cohesion. As each water molecule evaporates, it pulls on the next water molecule, and it pulls on the next. This relays the pull of evaporating water molecules all the way down to the roots. The cohesion of water helps to keep gravity from pulling the water molecules back down.
All right, so you're seeing here actually cohesion and adhesion at work. So what happens is as water evaporates into the sky, it creates almost like a suction. And as water molecules move towards that area where the water molecules are evaporating, because they're adhesive and cohesive, so cohesive, they're sticking to each other. Adhesive, they're sticking to the sides of these little tubes. These tubes in a plant are actually called, they have a name, they're called xylem. And they are like little tubes. You may have seen an experiment like this with celery, where you put celery in colored water. I don't know if anybody's ever done this. You put a piece of celery in here, and the celery has little leaves at the top, right? And then you leave it overnight, and then you can actually see the like food coloring in the veins, and the leaves of the celery turn, let's say this was red food coloring, they turn red. And that's actually the water traveling up celery by this same process. There's actually a special name for it traveling up these skinny tubes. That's actually called capillary action. And that is the water being attracted again to these little tubes inside, microscopic tubes inside of the stem. And cohesive to itself, and then adhesive to those tubes, and then being pulled by the evaporation at the leaves. Okay, the next thing that water does is water is a really good temperature moderator. It keeps you from getting too hot or too cold. Whenever hydrogen bonds break, remember those little bonds that are between water molecules, those bonds actually absorb heat. So when they are breaking and forming, it actually keeps the temperature from changing. So, for example, you may notice that if it's really hot outside and you go to the beach, the water is not as hot as the temperature of the air. That's because of this concept, that water has the ability to absorb heat and not actually change its temperature. And it makes it a really good temperature moderator because its temperature rises and falls very slowly. It's a good temperature moderator. The other thing that water does is it takes quite a bit of energy to evaporate it. And when it does evaporate, what it does is, like when sweat leaves your body, it uses your body's body heat as its source for evaporation. And that's called evaporative cooling. Basically, what's left behind on your skin is cooler because the hottest molecules escaped. They used your body heat as their source for evaporation. So some people think sweating cools you, but it's not the actual act of sweat coming out of your pores. It's the evaporation of the sweat off of your skin that takes body heat away. So a lot of times when you feel really hot, they say that it's not the heat, it's the humidity. Because if it's really humid, there's a lot of water vapor in the air, and it can almost feel like suffocating. Because basically water's not evaporating off of your skin as quickly. You've got all this humidity in the air, and you can feel like it's a lot hotter than it really is. Whereas when it's hot and dry outside, your sweat evaporates, and it tends to cool you down. And you can actually see the water vapor coming off of a hot person, especially if it's like a cold day, so it's the winter time, you can literally see that water vaporizing, the heat of that escaping the body. All right, and then water as ice. So this is very interesting. So water can be solid, liquid, or gas. You know that. Ice is solid water. But this is unusual. Water is less dense as a solid. So what actually happens in a liquid, remember it's forming hydrogen bonds, but they're being made and broken constantly. So you have a water molecule and it hydrogen bonds to another one, but then they let go and this one slides right past the other one. In ice, these hydrogen bonds all lock in place. It actually forces the water molecules further apart than they would be in liquid water because now they can't slide close to each other. They're locked in place. It forms, they call it like a honeycomb structure. So when ice forms, it's less dense, meaning it floats on the top. And what that means is that in a lake, the fish and the organisms that are underneath the water are going to be insulated or protected from the cold air because the ice floats on top and prevents the water from getting a lot colder. If that water was to sink to the bottom, if the ice, was to sink to the bottom instead, then lakes would freeze from the bottom up and all the living things would freeze to death. So it's really important that the ice floats on top. And so why can freezing water crack boulders? Because when it freezes, it swells. Like it explains here that ice actually takes up more space. That if it floats, it's less dense. That also means it takes up more space. This is also why if you've ever put a water bottle in the freezer and forgotten about it, your water bottle might have come out of the freezer all swollen and it won't stand up. And that's because you put it in there completely full of liquid water. Now when it freezes, that liquid pushes out because it's forming ice, which takes up more space. And now your water bottle, instead of being flat at the bottom, it's now like bulging at the bottom and it won't stand up. If you put a soda in the freezer and you forget about it, when it freezes, it'll crack the aluminum can. That's how strong it is. So freezing water can actually crack boulders. If you have water and it's stuck inside of a giant rock, when it freezes, it's actually going to swell and it might be enough force to actually crack that rock. And this is just showing again, see what I mean? So in liquid water, these bonds are breaking and reforming and these water molecules can slide past each other. But in ice, these bonds lock in place. Notice all the empty space here, and that's why the ice floats. All right, and so we're going to do this one next time. We're going to talk about how water forms solutions. Water is sometimes called the universal solvent because it dissolves so many things. So a solvent is something that dissolves things, and the things that get dissolved are called solutes. So you put a solute, such as dissolving, say, salt, in a solvent, such as water, and you get salty water. And the salt crystals are no longer, you can't see them anymore because they've dissolved. They're surrounded by the water. And you can dissolve sugar, and you can dissolve all kinds of other things. And so, we call those aqueous solutions. Any solution where water is the solvent, the liquid that's being used to dissolve stuff, is called an aqueous solution. And we're going to stop with that, and next time we're going to finish this off with acids and bases.